Targeting Barack Obama's legacy, the new US president makes his first moves against his predecessor's policies. Is the world on the verge of change? And what Obama-era policies might survive? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. From health insurance to the Iran nuclear deal, the outgoing US president left his mark on the US and the world. But for how long? The new US leader is wasting no time in repealing parts of the so-called Obamacare policy, raising questions about what he'll put in place of his predecessor's legacy. Mike Hanna reports from Washington, D.C.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
At this moment, Donald Trump becomes chief executive of the world's largest corporation.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
He said he would run the United States as a business, and from this day he heads a staff of nearly 3 million civilians and 1.5 million members of the armed services. In his first speech as President Donald Trump, his tone was dark, his criticism of the Washington elite sharing the platform blunt.
For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government while the people have borne the cost.
And presented to the people the vision of a nation looking inwards rather than out.
From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
Earlier in the day, the outgoing president left a note in the Oval Office for his successor. The era of Barack Obama ends as that of Donald Trump begins. One of his first actions as president, an executive order on the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, this having little immediate impact and regarded as more a statement of his intent to begin the complicated process of repealing it. This followed the inaugural parade through the streets of Washington, the crowds thinner than in inaugurations of the past, and some lining the route brandishing anti-Trump placards, but seemingly unnoticed by the president, who decided to walk part of the way. The route taking him past one of the hotels bearing his name, the staff loyally waving from the steps. As always, the day ends with a number of inaugural balls in the Capitol. But the divisive election and subsequent bitter debate has left its mark, and this year there seems to be something lacking. Perhaps that sense of national joy on a day that in the past the bulk of Americans would set aside their political differences and celebrate not just a new president, but also the democratic process that brought him to power. The beginning of a presidential term is for Donald Trump the end of an extraordinary journey. In his own words, he says, "The key to the way I promote is bravado." The bravado is as evident now as it was at the beginning of his long campaign, and whether or not it's tempered by the office, he's likely to continue doing things his way. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, Barack Obama entered the White House in 2009, offering an alternative to war-weary Americans. He promised he'd bring wars to a close. Let's take a look at his legacy then. First, the thaw in frozen relations with Cuba. Obama reopened the long-shuttered embassy in Havana and eased travel restrictions to the communist island. He also promised to close down the controversial American prison at Guantanamo Bay, but failed to deliver on that one. Then there was the landmark nuclear deal between Iran and world powers. It aimed to stop nuclear weapons being built, and sanctions were lifted. Obama pushed to deliver improved trade with Asia with a 12-nation Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. It's not yet cleared Congress, though. And what may be a turning point for the health of the planet, Obama supported the Paris Climate Agreement. Well, Obama's relations with the Kremlin were on shaky ground, especially after the Russian takeover of Crimea, fighting in Ukraine, and the war in Syria. In Iraq, Obama completed the withdrawal of U.S. combat troops. And in Israel and Palestine, Foreign Secretary John Kerry attempted unsuccessfully to barter a peace deal. Let's bring our guests into the show now. We have joining us from New York City, Robert Diamond, a former special advisor to President Barack Obama and the director of private sector engagement. Peter Trubowitz, the director of the United States Center at the London School of Economics. He's with us via Skype from London. And in St. Louis, Leah Wright, Rigueur, an assistant professor of public policy at Harvard University. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Leah, do you think perhaps one of Obama's most powerful legacies will actually be the loss of power for Democrats in the White House, in the Congress, perhaps even the loss of liberal power in the Supreme Court?
So absolutely, except the one caveat that I'll add is that this long predates and precedes Barack Obama. One of the things about his extraordinary win in 2008 and then his ascent to power in 2009 is that I think that we got a false sense of confidence in terms of political party power. But over the course of the last 8 years, we've really seen that power erode in ways that are startling. And in a lot of ways, the Democratic Party enters into 2017 at the weakest point it's been in decades. So I do think that this is something that we can attach both to Barack Obama, but also to the other aspects of the party, the Democratic Party, other leaders, and just kind of this neglect of the party at the state and local
Leah,
level and at the municipal level.
It kind of means that the outgoing president, his legacy will be shaped perhaps as much by Donald Trump as by what he did in office now.
Well, in some ways, yes, but I'm a historian by training, and it's a little early to say what is that legacy and what does it look like. It's going to be shaped by the context surrounding it, and once we know a little bit more, then we'll be able to see it. But definitely, the Democratic Party is in a very weak state right now. All
right, Leah makes a good point there. It is a bit early. Let's not jump the gun, Robert, but perhaps looking already at one of the first acts of Donald Trump to try and repeal parts of the so-called Obamacare shows there is going to be perhaps not a happy ending to Obamacare from Obama's perspective, right?
Well, yeah, obviously he signed his very first action yesterday, but I think that just underscored the fundamental question here of what does this replacement plan look like? We know the Republicans and we know the new president want to repeal it. Republicans in Congress voted over 40 times to attempt to repeal Obamacare. But we sit here today with no information about what this replacement plan will look like and what the tens of millions of Americans whose health insurance is at risk, what they have to replace it with.
Peter, the Obama administration adopted many environmental regulations, the Clean Power Plan and so on the international scene. He joined in to the Paris climate deal. To what extent would you say Obama turned around the U.S. approach to climate issues?
I think Obama moved the needle there in a significant way, both through efforts internationally and also through regulatory policies in the United States. He did a lot on that front and put a lot of policies in place. And I mean, while the Trump administration has taken already climate change off of the White House webpage, they're going to have their work cut out for them undoing or trying to undo everything that was put in place by Obama. I expect them to
why
move
do you think
in that
so?
direction, but it won't be easy. Because I think that this is an area where, well, first of all, they can move some in the area of executive action, but you can expect congressional resistance, at least from Democrats. The second issue, and I think we've already seen Jerry Brown in California put down a marker, that state governments are not going to necessarily follow the federal government's lead on this. And that's a very kind of interesting development. I mean, California is not a small state. This is a state with an economy that's bigger than many, many countries. And so I think that this is an area where we can expect Trump and Trump's team to push but it's not going to be pushing against an open door. There's going to be pushback. And the same thing goes, I mean, I'll just go to the last point about healthcare. There will be pushback. These guys are playing with fire. It's not that
well, Peter, you mentioned the
it.
Democrats are not going to be very helpful in Congress, but maybe I'll take this point to Leah. They're in a minority. What sort of position are they really in to challenge and stop anything that Trump or the Republicans want to do?
Sure. Well, in the case of healthcare, it still remains, parts of the healthcare law remain incredibly popular. And I really think it's playing with fire to repeal and not have a replacement to address the very real needs of healthcare in this country. It also is interesting because what Republicans are saying and what the president is saying actually slightly differ, including, at one point, Donald Trump saying there will be universal health care for people in this country. That's very different from what people are talking about in Congress, and that has the potential to create a public crisis because people in the United States want health care, and they want affordable health care.
All right, let me try and shift us back, looking at the environment once again. Robert, what does this ultimately mean? Is the U.S., do you think, going to remain on track to achieve that goal of an 80% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050, which Obama committed the U.S. to in November?
Well, I think you have to remember here that this is bigger. This is an issue bigger than just President Trump. You look at the Paris Agreement. You had nearly 200 countries around the world come together. You have nearly all of the leading companies in the world. You have the private sector mobilized and investing billions and billions of dollars into clean energy technology and consuming clean energy. You have the states, you have provinces around the world, you have cities, you have civil society, all who have moved in the direction of clean energy. You have explosive growth in solar and wind that is now cheaper to produce and cleaner to produce. You have the moral issues, the public health issues. So this is bigger than just whether or not Donald Trump thinks
at the same time,
climate
Trump
change
and
is
some
real.
members of his team, Robert, are talking about drilling and new exploration. I mean, might that change the picture a little bit? What can the world expect? Can it still expect a cleaner America?
Well, yeah, I think, there's the goal of energy independence is not a bad thing in and of itself. And that's something that the President Obama worked very hard on to free America's dependence on foreign oil. And I don't think that we're going to flip a switch tomorrow and solve that problem. But again, when you look at where clean energy has gone in the last 8 years, the last 10 years, that's irreversible in my opinion, because you have such large portions of the economy involved and such consensus around the world that this is where the direction needs to head.
All right, let me take the point to London once again now, looking at other major foreign policy issues, Peter. One of Obama's major achievements, of course, was the Iran nuclear deal, clinched in July 2015. Do you think it's going to endure going forward?
I think that's a little unclear. Some of this is going to depend upon how Trump's team, what the lines of cleavage are inside Trump's cabinet end up being. I mean, I think on that particular policy, I mean, if the American firsters inside the Trump administration do gain the upper hand, there will be pushback there. But the question is whether or not you see a countervailing coalition emerge inside the administration, worried about kind of the unintended consequences of undoing agreements like that particular agreement in the region. So I think this is just, it's a little too early to say. I also think that, part of the problem here in thinking about Obama's legacy, I mean, there's some advantages to doing this policy by policy, but I think kind of, I would use broader brushstrokes in thinking about where Obama tried to change things, how he changed them, and then the extent to which, Trump is going to be able to push back. I mean, it's important to remember, I think one of the things that Obama really tried to do very early in his administration was improve America's brand name, which was badly damaged during the Bush years. And the second was to reduce the cost and blood and treasure of American foreign policy, to basically, if you will, shift the balance of international and domestic accounts, and a third being to kind of shift from near-term problems like Al-Qaeda to longer-term challenges such as China, climate change, nuclear proliferation. And I think in that context, he moved the needle on things like Iran. And whether or not that sticks, I think remains to be seen. It's very easy when you're running for president or you're the party out of power to go after issues like that. It's harder.
All right, let me latch on. I know you're keen to talk about the broader brushstroke, so let me tie in a broader brushstroke issue, if I could call it that,
Sure.
onto this issue that we're talking about, Iran. It also has to do, really, does it not, with a question of to what extent can a Trump-led US fly in the face of international law? Because let's not forget, even if we talk about Iran, maybe I'll put this question to Leah. Even if we talk about Iran, let's not forget the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231 approved that deal. So basically, the Trump administration would have to be going against the Security Council to undo that one, wouldn't it?
Well, I think this is part of where this larger debate about the different coalitions within the White House and as they emerge, what actually happened. So what we've seen so far is that Donald Trump is really good at bombastic rhetoric and talking a big game about what he'll do and who he'll be allies with.
Okay, so how do you read that, Leah, then? Are we seeing the sort of return to the unilateralism of the Bush era, or more of a continuation of multilateralism voice will prevail in the Trump-led Oval Office?
So I think we can definitely say that it's not going to be the Obama era, right? That it's not going to be the Obama policies, and it's not going to be this forward thinking or kind of trying to think about this in global terms. But what we've seen is that there are very different attitudes that are emerging from the cabinet, and a lot of this really depends on who ends up being on, right? Who ends up advising and who ends up dictating the conversation. It's not clear where that is within the White House right now, and I think that's the biggest cause for concern.
All right, well, Robert, I don't think anyone can deny that Obama broke down that decades-long impasse in Cuban-American relations. How much of a turnaround has there been, and how much of it will remain, given what Donald Trump has been talking about? He's called that deal one-sided.
Just two quick points on Iran that I think are fundamental to remember. One, this is not a bilateral agreement between the United States and Iran. This is a multilateral agreement that includes the Russians, the Chinese, the Europeans. So, the president does not have the ability, is going to face significant resistance from his international partners when he goes down the road to potentially repeal this deal. Secondly, what is he replace it with? Again, we have a fundamental question of, you can talk about doing away with something or repealing something, but he's not articulated any plan as to what he would replace it with, which is a fundamental question. When it comes to Cuba, the President Obama's policy was very simple. 50 years of policy vis-a-vis Cuba didn't work, and it was time to try something new. And again, if President Trump can articulate a better plan, I think we all look forward to hearing what it involves.
All right. There's one big issue here we can't avoid, of course, Russia. Now, Obama leaves the relationship strained with Russia over Ukraine, over Syria, over sanctions. To what extent, Robert, do you think we will see a real different approach, a real different dynamic emerge between the US and Russia?
Well, one, I want to clarify, when you say that the president leaves the relationship with Russia strained, that's because of the actions that Russia has taken over the last few years. This was not just a choice that President Obama made to allow relationships with Russians to deteriorate. Russia's actions on the global stage have isolated itself and caused the response that you've seen out of the former administration. But going forward, there's obviously major questions that are still open. You saw reporting just in the last few days that U.S. law enforcement intelligence agencies are conducting an investigation about Trump's associates and their relationships with Russia. And that is an open question as to what's going to come of those investigations. What influence did the Russian government have over this election? What influence did it have over Trump's advisors? Those are ongoing questions that may have serious implications for not just the U.S.-Russia relationship, but this administration in general.
Well, Peter, tied to the US-Russian relationship is the situation in the Middle East, in one sense. One of Obama administration's perceived legacies, at least, is a declining influence in the Middle East, with Russia appearing to be more of the kingmaker in Syria than the US, for example. We've seen Obama having in his first term to back down over the whole face-off with Israel's prime minister over settlements. And we've seen what happened in Iraq after Obama oversaw the US withdraw from that country and ISIL move into many parts and take over of Iraq. How do you think all of that dynamic might change now under a Trump-led America?
Well, I mean, what I look for in terms of Trump's general foreign policy priorities is for him to be focusing most of his attention actually on Asia and on Europe, and to try to redefine the terms of U.S. international engagement in both of those places. But as Obama learned, because Obama also tried to invest much more time, energy, and political capital in Asia, that Middle East has a way of calling people back. I think to the extent that Trump does focus on the Middle East, I think it's going to be narrower than Obama, and the focus will in particular be on ISIS. He's got a number of people inside his administration who treat that as a priority. But I think kind of if you were to take a kind of step back, most of Trump's early moves with respect to the phone call to President Tsai in Taiwan and the recent interviews in Europe regarding NATO suggest at any rate that early on this is going to be the primary focus. And I think there Russia plays a role probably in Trump's mind, that the idea of kind of improving relations with Putin may provide a means. He may be thinking about it this way, a means to gain leverage, perhaps leverage in dealing with China, and perhaps leverage in dealing with America's allies in Europe.
I'm glad Peter touched on Asia there. Asia, a very important part of the Obama administration's legacy layer with the pivot towards Asia policy. The Obama administration spent a considerable amount of time since 2009 trying to build strategic partnerships with countries in Asia. How much of that do you think will last now?
I'll just say quickly that one of the things that Donald Trump campaigned against and really campaigned on, and that really resonated with his base, was campaigning against all of the things that that Barack Obama has done in terms of these Asian partnerships. Now, how much of this will actually happen, and how much of this will either be undone or just we won't see through, I think is the real question. But I mean, in terms of his language,
but in a sense, there he also wants to contain. Donald Trump wants to contain
aggressive.
China, and if he wants to do that, one assumes he's going to need to enhance relationships in Asia or other parts of Asia.
I mean, you would think, but right now we really don't know, because what Donald Trump has done is talk, right? And so he's talked and talked and talked, and we don't actually know what he'll do. One of the things he's actually quite exceptional at doing is coming out with a policy that is completely at odds with what he's been saying, and then saying, this is what I said all along. So, it remains to be seen, but that seems like one of those touch issues that realistically, for him to kind of pivot on something like that, it just doesn't seem like it's something he would do. I just don't know if he has the capacity
I think we've got about
to actually do what he's going to say
30 seconds
that he's going
left,
to do.
and I know Peter wanted to come in on this, so briefly in 30 seconds, go ahead,
Yes.
Peter.
Well, I mean, I think that China will be kind of front and center for the Trump administration. I mean, his general view is that China's been taking America to the cleaners on trade. And I think really the question that Americans, and alas, their allies in Asia and Europe, should be asking themselves is really, what is Trump prepared to do to strengthen America's bargaining leverage vis-a-vis China? And just as importantly, what's he prepared to give up to get concessions from Beijing? So I'd keep your eyes on Moscow, Pyongyang, and Taipei. I mean, if he focuses his energy on China, he's going to be looking for pressure points, and he's going to need bargaining chips to cut a deal that he's going to be able to sell back home.
All right, a lot for us to keep our eyes on. We'll have to end the discussion there. Let's thank our guests for now, Robert Diamond, Peter Trubowitz, and Leah Wright Rigueur. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here for now, it's goodbye.